Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion and book launch event for Craft in Art Therapy, Diverse Approaches to the Transformative Power of Craft Materials and Methods. My name is Sage Brousseau. I'm Director of Education at Fuller Craft Museum in Brockton, Massachusetts. I'm very pleased to have you all joining us today for this very special event. Our mission at Fuller Craft is to provide meaningful discovery of contemporary craft through exhibitions, collections, education, and public programs. We're committed to challenging perceptions and building appreciation of the material world. Our purpose is to inspire, stimulate, and enrich an ever-expanding community. And to learn more about our collection, exhibitions, other upcoming virtual events, or becoming a member, please visit us at fullercraft.org. And joining me today is Lauren Leone, a fiber artist, board certified art therapist, and licensed mental health counselor working with art therapy participants in clinical and community-based settings in Somerville and Boston, Mass. She's assistant professor of art therapy at Lesley University and the editor of Craft and Art Therapy, Diverse Approaches to the Transformative Power of Craft, Materials, and Methods, why we're all here today. Lauren's research interests include the unique therapeutic benefits of craft materials and media for art therapy practice, socially engaged craft practices, and how craft activism can support art therapy practitioners and participants in being change agents. Lauren holds an MA in clinical mental health counseling with a specialization in art therapy from Lesley University and a doctorate of art therapy from Mount Mary University. I am so happy to have you here today, Lauren, and I'm really excited for you to introduce us all to your contributors and our panelists today. So please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sage. Thank you to all the panelists and also to all the attendees. Super excited that you're all here. Before we get started, Sandie Yi, one of our panelists, is going to walk us through some access guides for using Zoom.
In the spirit of disability culture, today's talk will start by providing an access notes and just very quickly an audio description of who I am for those of you who are not seeing the screen or who do not use eyesight as the main information processing mechanism. I am a Taiwanese woman with tanned skin, light tan skin. I have long hair and I am wearing a red top. So starting with the first item on our access is when it is time you to speak, please state this is Sandie speaking or this is Lauren speaking. A lot of us may be calling in instead of having a screen in front of us. So this will help people navigate who is talking right now. And this event has live captioning. So to view the full transcription, it is also called streamlined text. Click on caption, then full transcript, sorry. And thank you, our captioner, Erica Cook, for providing your service today. And please refrain from using chat because it is not accessible to screen readers during the panelist conversations, unless it is your access needs, meaning that may be the only way that will work for you in terms of communication. One of us will read through the messages in the chat box during the Q&A, and there will be time for Q&A at the end of the panel. Next slide, please. So you may see or hear sounds of the home companions, including cats and dogs, or I don't know, running people, children, somebody, as we are all working at our homes. So there may be times that you didn't quite get what the panelists were saying. So please feel free to ask the panelists to repeat. And then, you know, how we all learn things differently. So please explain terms or concepts that are not familiar to you. Lastly, make yourself comfortable. In disability culture, we recognize that everyone has different ways to occupy the space. So feel free to stretch, knit, doodle, stim, move around, and change body postures and seats. And this is something that you probably see me doing a lot, constantly trying to find a better spot for me when I sit down. So I'm going to give the mic back to Lauren.
Thank you, Sandie. So this is Lauren talking. And give a land acknowledgement, just given the diverse locations of panelists and attendees today. This virtual event is physically situated across many original, ancestral, and often unceded Indigenous homelands. I'd like to recognize the land that I'm on, and also the land that the Fuller Museum is on is located in what's currently known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which includes the Massachusetts, Nutmuk, and Wampanoag nations that persist despite having been threatened by disease, death, re-education, and governmental control in exchange for the diplomacy they extended to early US colonial settlers. We ask that you pay respect to these lands as well as our Indigenous brethren and elders, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in their homeland. And we also ask that you operationalize your allyship by supporting the work of organizations that seek to empower and invest in Indigenous communities and promote and preserve their cultural and traditional ways of being, including the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness and the North American Indian Center of Boston. And later in the chat, I will drop a document that has resources that we'll be mentioning throughout this talk, and that will include that. I also just want to briefly acknowledge the current events we're living through. It feels weird to move forward without doing that. It's, you know, disturbing time as we live through a global pandemic. Last week's violence at the Capitol, a second presidential impeachment that started this week. And while these aren't surprising events, they're deeply distressing for many of us. And I just also want to acknowledge how they impact people of color disproportionately. And that we're heading into a week that brings us Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday and our inauguration, and continued risk of violence, and that we need to acknowledge white supremacist insurrection, which is by no means over, as an indication of how much work we still need to do. Although I don't think any of us on the panel would claim that craft alone can dismantle white supremacy, I'm really grateful for the work of all the panelists in advancing social justice aims in their practice and also in their greater communities. So now I would like to introduce you to our panel. Mikey Anderson is a queer artist, art therapist who graduated from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago with a BFA in fine art and an MA in art therapy and counseling. Their practice is informed by a community-driven art therapy practice, which incorporates fiber crafts, queer theory, and activism. Their art therapy practice has spanned multiple age groups, from children, adolescents, and young adults to elders. And Mikey believes that collectively we create inclusive spaces that are communal, participatory, and open-ended through crafting. These spaces provide the opportunity for constructing alternative narratives that reject the dominance of heteronormativity. Next panelist is Marilyn Holmes, originally from Louisville, Kentucky, received her master's in art therapy counseling at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. And while pursuing her education, Marilyn also served as a graphic designer for the Louisville Family Justice Advocates, an organization focused on advancing policies and practices for families with incarcerated loved ones in Louisville, Kentucky. Holmes's research interests revolve around exploring the experiences of Black art therapy graduate students suffering from racial battle fatigue and the future of multicultural art therapy education. Currently, she works as an outpatient community counselor at East St. Louis, Illinois, while pursuing her full counseling license and art therapy credentials. Rachel Wallis is our next panelist. She's a community taught crafter, artist, and activist. She's interested in transgressing the lines between fine art and craft and engaging in questions of identity, labor, and value when it comes to the creation and appreciation of art. Her work focuses on collaborative community quilting projects addressing issues of race and social justice. Rachel completed an MA in art and social practice at Moore College of Art and Design in 2016. Her work has been featured in the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Journal of Surface Design, and Art Therapy for Social Justice, Radical Intersections. She's taught classes or served as artist in residence at the School of the Art Institute, a studio in the Woods, Lil Street Art Center, and the Coffee Creek Women's Correctional Center, and is currently the artist in residence at Project NIA. And finally, Sandie Yi recently defended her PhD dissertation in disability studies from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's a disabled artist and an art therapist and disability cultural worker whose work, Crip Couture, focuses on wearable art made for and with disabled people. Her interests include disability arts and culture, disability fashion, accessibility design and programming for arts and cultural venues, and social justice informed art therapy. So thank you so much to panelists for being here today and sharing your research and practice with us. And I also just want to take a moment to thank all of the artists and authors of the book for their contributions and sharing their amazing work. So in a couple of minutes, each panelist is going to share a little bit about their work, and then we'll go into a panel discussion. But before that, I just wanted to share a little bit about the book before we move into that. I know that we have an audience that probably comes to this with varying degrees of exposure and experience to craft, to art therapy. So just to ground us, if you're new to art therapy, a real quick explanation is that art therapy is a mental health profession that was formalized in the mid-20th century that uses art media and creative process and product to promote well-being in a range of settings, including clinical and community settings. And my interest in editing a book about craft and art therapy really came directly from my doctoral research, where I found that historically craft has been devalued and underrepresented in art therapy literature. And there are lots of reasons for this. We don't have time to get into all of them right now. Many are in the book. But I think the most important reason is that art therapy has followed a Eurocentric fine arts paradigm that has created these boundaries that have historically divided art and craft, and that these divisions have been either overtly or subtly constructed along gender, racial, and class lines, and are rooted in the marginalization of groups with strong craft traditions. So in the US, that would be Black, Latinx, and Native peoples, for example. And so the result of this is that misconceptions about craft have affected its perceived value in art therapy, with the result that many art therapy participants may not have had access to materials and processes that could benefit them greatly. So craft practices, especially textiles, have started to be represented more in art therapy literature, and I think that's really exciting. And so the book really aims to bring attention to the value of craft and invite art therapists to widen our conception of what we use when working with individuals and communities. And then I just wanted to focus for a moment on this concept of craft as power. So the book's title comes from Jack Bradish and Heidi Brush's conception of craft as power, or the ability or capacity to act. And they were really emphasizing the potential of craft practices for social and political action. And that's a concept that I'd like everyone watching today to keep in mind as we move through the panel. So first up, Mikey Anderson is going to share a little bit about their work.
Hi, everyone. This is Mikey speaking. I use they and he pronouns. So in my chapter, Queer Ethos in Art Therapy, I used critical art-based research through quilting. It's where I examine notions of self-care, healing, and to reflect on how I'm queering my art therapy practice. I use quilting to question and challenge the heteronormativity in art therapy literature and beyond. I use quilting to process the collective pain queer clinicians felt in reaction to the American Art Therapies Association's alignment with Karen Pence. And then my chapter considers queering art therapy from an intersectional lens, from queer voices and perspectives. And I believe I use my crafts as political fuel to queer up spaces. And then the image is from my story quilt group I did with elders. And it's also the quilt I speak to at the introduction of my chapter. So we can go to the next slide. So this is a visual summary of my chapter through comic making. And it focuses on just different aspects of my chapter I speak to. And it was another form for me to convey my idea about how I'm queering art therapy. So we can go to the next one. So this is my queer quilt, and this is an image of myself engaging with the quilt, and of course, like I'm holding it right now to calm my nerves. But so this is the quilt I use for my critical art-based research. I wanted to showcase the love and care I had for both the making of the quilt and my response to the quilt. So on the quilt, I embroidered slurs I grew up hearing, and I knitted pockets from scraps that I had knitted during knitting circles at a women's shelter I interned at. And within those pockets holds little mini zines that include queer resources for art therapists to use and to look up on their own. We can go to the next slide. And so I found myself queering my art therapy practice with collective quilting and multiple craft projects, but I wanted to highlight this one because I feel like it sums up what really brought me to like the idea of queering art therapy. And it was a Pride Quilts project I did inspired by the AIDS quilt with LGBTQ elders to showcase their stories and how Pride resonates with them now, and to showcase and advocate for the needs of LGBTQ elders they deserve, and now only compounded during the COVID pandemic. And it was also a place for us to connect and build community together. And so the first image is the group of elders working together on our quilt squares, and then this is our massive quilt that still hangs at the center on Halstead, with everyone's different quilt squares we created. So we can go to the next slide. And so this is kind of where my queering art therapy has most recently shifted into, and it's reimagining gender through plushie making with youth. And so these are projects where I use my crafts, especially my plushies, to amplify queer youth voices in my groups, to disrupt heteronormativity in these spaces, and just in general, disrupt the notion that all youth are straight and cisgendered. But I'm doing it through like a radical, soft, cute lens. I think that's, yeah, thank you.
This is Lauren speaking, and thank you, Mikey, so much. And next up is Marilyn Holmes.
Hello, this is Marilyn speaking. So my book chapter is titled Emptying the Jar, Crochet to Unpack Toxic Racial Stress. And I started working to also discuss a gap in literature, especially art therapy education literature. There is so much literature on teaching white art therapists how not to be racist towards non-white clients, but there is a significant lack of literature for non-white therapists on the receiving end of racism from clients, from other clinicians, from supervisors, and things like that. And I realized when I was in grad school that I was going to have to investigate a method of personal and effective containment. So containment is a concept where we take maybe negative emotions or difficult emotions or big emotions and put them in a special place, like a journal, a box, a jar, something outside of your body, so you're no longer carrying that emotional stress inside of yourself. So for myself, I wanted to develop a method of containment and externalization that was specific towards my experience as a Black woman in a primarily white space. This included defining what a microaggression is and their effects on my practice as an art therapist and how it was affecting my education. So my overall goal became to contain the stress and use it to create something new. To guide this practice, I turned to the American Art Therapy Association's Code of Ethics and also the American Counseling Association's Code of Ethics, because both of these ethics codes say that we as therapists have a responsibility to take care of ourselves in order to take care of our clients the best way we can. So I knew that it wasn't just a personal need, it was an imperative in order for me to be the best practitioner that I could be. So to do that, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. I began developing an arts-based procedure for specified containment. What I began doing was creating these crochet animals. The first one you saw on the last slide was a jellyfish that is yellow and purple. I was watching a nature documentary, and I learned that even though jellyfish have enough venom and toxicity within them to kill a grown man, to kill an elephant even, they actually can't sting themselves. So jellyfish can be in their own poison and not hurt themselves. And I found that to be just an excellent metaphor for thinking of the toxicity that I was taking in. And I trusted this jellyfish creature to hold my toxicity. So what I did in this kind of specified procedure was write down the entirety of the encounter or the negative thoughts or the what I wish I would have done differently. I wrote them down, folded them up, and I created an animal to hold that recollection. Over time, I began to change my process. So the jellyfish is about this big. I'm holding up my hands about 4 or 5 inches apart. So it's a very small container. The image on this slide is of a unicorn with 3 legs. His name is Tripod. And he is instead about a foot tall and a foot wide. And he is stuffed with denim. So he looks really soft, but he's actually very difficult to move. And that's because that's what racism felt like to me. It's very difficult to move in. It's very difficult to function. So I wanted to take all of that experience and reflect it in the materials, even though on the outside he looks fun and cute and bubbly, much like I think I do. He is still holding on this toxicity and taking care of it so I don't have to. Over time, these methods evolved and I began making meaning with more symbolism. We can go to the next slide. So these are 2 more of my creatures. A conch shell for when I felt like I wasn't being heard. You know, when you hold a seashell up to your head and you think you're hearing the ocean, but all you're hearing is the blood rushing in your head. It felt like that. I was just hearing my own voice being reflected back at me and no one was actually going to do anything. So created a conch to reflect that so I could keep moving forward. And then Oscar, my owl, for a moment where I wish I would have been wiser and picked my battles. He currently lives with my mom, but I still love him. And then after that, we can go to the next slide. This is Albie and Martin. Albie is a yellow creature wearing a hat. For a time when I was seeking comfort and feeling a bit left out in the cold. So when I felt that way, I made Albie a little hat with a puffball so that he would feel a little bit more protected, like I thought I needed to be protected. And then Martin was more of an anxiety-driven project. If you can see his image, his head slumps over to the side. And that was an accident, but I think it reflected how anxious I actually was because it felt like I couldn't stand up on my own without feeling the need to fall over. So all of my creatures, they reflect my state and they are growing with me. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today.
This is Lauren speaking. Marilyn, thank you so much. And I think I'm up next. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my chapter in this book, which came directly from my doctoral research, focusing on how craft activism can support art therapy participants in being agents of social change. So these were my 7 co-researchers, and we called our group Crafting Change. And just a little bit about us, we all identify as women. The group ranges very broadly in age. We hold a range of racial and ethnic identities, and many group members are of a lower socioeconomic status. And over the course of 4 months, we met at a community health center in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston to collaboratively create a quilt that aimed to raise community awareness about the gentrification and displacement taking place in the neighborhood. And Roxbury has a really rich cultural history, including a lot of jazz clubs that have closed, and we posited due to gentrification, and also a rich history of public art and grassroots activism, but also experiences high rates of poverty and has the second highest rate of mental health hospitalizations among Boston's neighborhoods. And we chose specifically to make a quilt because of the strong connection to African American heritage and the cultural resonance that this provided for many of the groups. So on this slide, you can see individual photos of each group member. So here are a couple of images from the quilt. On the left, you can see Leslie Square, which is a photo of Connolly's, which was a jazz club that no longer exists. So it's a black and white photo transfer and has colorful embroidery on it for the words Connolly's, liquors, and cocktails. And this is now a vacant lot that the room that we met to make our quilt in overlooked. So it felt really poignant that something so close to where we were working had been a really important part of many of the members of our groups' cultural experience growing up and was no longer there. And then Brenda Square on the right is on a bright green background. There's a house made out of black fabric with white birds on it. There's an image of Cicely Tyson in the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, and the words, "Where do we go from here? We can't live here anymore. Why? Money." And so as we quilted, we used discussion, storytelling, and the art making process itself to collectively reflect, especially focusing on how displacement affects elders. And the imagery and text included on the quilt really emerged from these discussions and included lots of historic buildings and also national and local community leaders of the past and present. And we organized a traveling exhibit so that as many people as possible could see the quilt. And as we did that, we really strategized about who to invite to these events based on who we felt would benefit from hearing this call to action, which was to wake up everybody. That's kind of a message that kept coming up in the quilt making. And also who had institutional power to potentially ally with us and affect policy around development in the neighborhood. So on this slide, you can see an image of the whole quilt. It's pretty big. I think it was, well, I don't remember the dimensions now, but at least 90, over 100 inches tall and about 80 something inches wide. It's on a bright yellow background, and there are lots of colorful patches, about 20 in total. And as we met and kind of analyzed our data and discussed our experience, we found the following impacts emerge from our work together. So we found that the project supported participants by creating a sense of agency through instilling a new or renewed sense of awakening and motivation to contribute, building a feeling of pride, and also offering sensory and symbolic benefits through the craft medium itself. The project also created a collaborative and a strength-based environment in which the group developed authentic, trusting relationships, shared both leadership and knowledge generation, and experienced a sense of shared purpose. And then on a community level, the quilt allowed the group to be heard by their own community and also communities that might not ordinarily listen to them, and also served as a way to multiply and disseminate the knowledge that the group generated over the course of the project into the larger community. And so even though this project stopped after our data analysis, we continue to meet now over 4 years later. And we've continued to present the quilt in a range of settings. So we presented it at the Community Health Center a few times, also at the Fuller Craft Museum. Thank you to Beth McLaughlin. To art therapy classes, to a senior group at the YMCA in Roxbury, to the Museum of the National Center for Afro-American Art, which is also in Roxbury. And we even got an offer to show it at Boston City Hall when one of our group members came across Ayanna Presley when she was still a city councilor at an Easter egg hunt and ran up to her and got her assistant's contact info. So we've been working on another quilt that honors women of color who have made significant contributions to history. And these range in chronology from Ida B. Wells to the Squad. And unfortunately, we've had to pause because of the pandemic. And this has really highlighted other social justice issues, including the digital divide. Not everyone in our group has access, so we can't just meet on Zoom the way I think a lot of us assume we can just conduct life right now. And also how the pandemic is disproportionately impacting people of color and elders. So I'm looking forward to when we can all meet again. And once we finish this quilt, we really are planning to partner with organizations where we feel exhibiting it will serve an education and also an inspirational focus. And then finally, these are the therapeutic benefits that we identified from our project. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but I wanted to call out the second to last one because this is one that really resonated for everyone in the group. And that was being awakened and awakening others. And so even though our group initially identified the intent of waking up the community, most group members reported that they felt that they effectively woke themselves up through this project. They recognized that they had something important to say, and they felt this increased personal drive and motivation to contribute more to the community, coupled with the sense of agency to do so. And so by focusing on this process of sharing a call to action, most participants found themselves compelled and motivated into action as well. So really, in summary, what we found was that in a community model of art therapy, collaborative craft activism built people's capacity to address the issues that were facing them in their communities, and also that developing these skills held a therapeutic function. Thanks. So, Rachel, you're up.
Hi, this is Rachel speaking. Thanks so much for having me here today. My chapter was actually co-written by Savneet Talwar because unlike everyone I'm sharing the stage with today, I am not an art therapist. I'm a crafter and activist and artist, but a lot of my training and background comes from both my lived experiences and things I've learned directly from my community members and my elders. And so Savneet and my chapter is pretty representative of our relationship and our collaborations thus far, but it's this conversation between art therapy and art and activism and craft, and what we have to learn from each other and to teach each other in our varied practice. And personally, this is important to me because my craft and activist work and art is really around using quilting and craft practices to create spaces that awaken this idea of radical empathy, really feeling strongly for people whose lived experience might be different than your own, and using that to sort of work towards social change more broadly. Next slide. The images of a banner that's a quilted map of Chicago. And this is one of my first community quilting projects I did. In 2013, I worked with a collective of women to embroider the names of everyone who was killed in street violence that year onto a map of Chicago and the neighborhood where they died. Next slide. So some of these, because of the really stark discrimination, segregation, disinvestment in Chicago, some neighborhoods have been really impacted by violence. We couldn't even fit all of the names in a single neighborhood, whereas other areas of the city were untouched. And this project was a really radical and radicalizing experience for all of us to really think about the impact of street violence on communities and the sources of it. But we found that the response to the piece, both in conversations we were having and in the media, felt really shallow, that this radical experience of creating the piece was very different than the experience of viewing it, which often just reinforced sort of people's already held ideas about crime and violence. So I really was interested in how do we widen the making experience to involve a larger community than just the viewing experience. Next slide. So that went into a project called Gone But Not Forgotten. And this image is of a quilting circle. Over about 2 years, I held a series of quilting circles across Chicago, using restorative justice peace circle techniques to bring people together to talk about police violence and to memorialize some of the people who had been killed by the Chicago police. Next slide. This is actually how I met Sandie. So this is a picture of one of the final panels of the project. It ended up being 7 quilt panels, which featured around 150 names of people who had been killed over a 10-year period. It's alternating blue and white quilt squares with a 6-pointed star with a name, age, and date of death of somebody who was killed by the Chicago police. Next slide. And this is a panel of family members of people who had been killed by police, sitting in front of the quilt panels. And so the things that really came together in this was not only widening participation, so this involved hundreds of people across the city in different community spaces, giving people a chance to really deepen into the individual impact of police violence. So stitching one name, reading one story, hearing about these individuals, but then sort of connecting it back up to community organizations, to family members of people who had been killed by the police, and to networks through which people could take action and get involved with this. Rather than just thinking and feeling, we wanted it to be linked to a next step. Next slide. So this led to a project that I engaged in with Sandie based on my experience teaching in a women's prison in Oregon. There's a picture of the prison. Next slide. This was a project called Inheritance, Quilting Across Prison Walls, where Sandie and I taught storytelling and quilt history and quilt design classes in Cook County Jail, and had individuals incarcerated there design quilts for their loved ones. Next slide. We then took those designs, because we weren't able to sew inside the jail, and we gave them to volunteer quilters on the outside to make into quilts that were then delivered to the recipient of the person's choice. So you're going to see some pictures here that are side by side, a design of a quilt and then what got made of it. Next slide. Next slide. And there are image descriptions of these quilts. If you're unable to see them, you can, I'm trying to respect the time limit, which I'm already over. Next slide. But in addition to this work inside the jail with the participants and outside with the volunteer quilters, we also held these quilting circles in community in partnership with the organizations working on the issues of money bond, family separation, pretrial incarceration. So we tried to, the participants in the circle would embroider writing from the classroom participants onto a quilt. Next slide. To create these public pieces that you can see here. So it's a combination of quilt squares based on the quilts that the students designed, and then squares embroidered in the community quilting circles with writing from the participants about what they inherited in their own families and what they'd want their families to inherit from them. So just in general, asking these questions of like, when we think about these community projects, when we think about the healing power of craft, asking these questions about consent, centering the voices of the community, who's benefiting from projects, are you thinking about the harm involved, and you know, how do you address underlying structures in these craft projects, were all things we really tried to capture in our chapter. And that's it for me.
This is Lauren talking. Rachel, thank you so much. And also thank you to Sandie for her work in this chapter. And great questions that you're bringing up, which we are going to get to during our panel discussion. And next up is Sandie.
This is Sandie speaking. In my chapter, I first talked about what self-care has meant to me personally as a disabled woman who was born with 2 fingers. And so a lot of the questions that people ask about my disability, my impairment, most of the time they come from a sense of curiosity, like, are you able to carry out the everyday function that we don't get to see? And so a lot of time people want to make sure that, yeah, she can handle things with her hands. So this is one of the experience that a lot of disabled people have shared, which is that we always have to prove ourselves to say that, yes, we are worthy of living. We are desirable human beings. So when it comes to self-care, what does that mean? So the idea of like pull yourself up by the bootstraps, it is has been, and it's hopefully not always, but this expectation has imposed on disabled people a lot. Like, if you're not taking care of yourself, you are not putting efforts, you are not making contributions, and you are becoming a burden to the society. And so the way I was thinking about self-care, such individualistic approach to, you know, making ourselves better, or as our therapist, how to sustain our work as we are supporting other people. And everything that I felt, the conversation that we have had has focused on, yes, you know, do something to make yourself feel better, and including buying expensive stuff, including making art. And I want to say that making art is great, is awesome, and it is a core value of what we do. But I'm also hearing many of my graduate students, including myself when I was a grad student, when things get so stressed out, if we didn't make art, it almost sounds like you're not attending to your professional skill. So I raised questions about self-care through my own disability narratives, which is like, why do we have to do everything by ourselves? And my work experience with disability communities in Taiwan made me realize that, you know, sometimes the things that we do together as communities, it can be art making, but art can also mean different things according to the communities, including people getting together and washing their wheelchairs, including people getting together and talking about what do we do in next protest. But these actions, these daily tasks may not be seen as self-care. But my main point was like, how do we think about self-care beyond that? You know, this is something that you need to fix. And there's a parallel between this idea of like fix the problems, such a quite a medical model of disability, thinking about you have to become like the non-disabled, you have to become the race of the privileged racial group, you have to become, and these identities are always something that most of us are not, or the expectations are not something that we are a part of. So here is an image of my work. Image description: a Caucasian model wearing a pair of open-toed calf-height boots, which are mostly made with latex and plastic. This pair of boots has an uneven skin-like surface, where thick scars from creases and bumps in brownish, orange, and beige colors. Skin-like latex pieces slightly drape themselves like flower petals blooming on top of the boots. Large openings on the front and side of the boots reveal the model's burn scars. The model's burn scars from skin graft surgeries are also revealed on her knees and lower thighs. Black stitches are used to hold the wall of the boots together. The model's toes have turquoise nail polish. Parts of the soles were made with a layer of white plastic, which has an organic fluid quality. Next slide, please. So reflecting on the lack of connection to disability culture and communities and disability identity, I realized that it was something that made me feel so alone, even though I was born with my disability and I do have family members who share similar impairments. But if disability is something that we never talked about, it has always been like an unspoken rule, like, no, you don't want to talk about something that makes you feel sad, or you don't want to look down at yourself because you are different. But when we don't talk about it, it's like, yes, how do I create a space to really look at me being a different person? And lack of disability culture, I feel like it did not help my understanding of self-help, self-care. So I argue for a collective care model over the individualistic care, self-care model. And I used a few of my artwork, including the one that I shared in the last slides, and also the current slides, to demonstrate how I use the idea of disability plus fashion, crip couture, CRIP, COUTURE, to make body adornments for and also with fellow disabled artists. So image description for this image is: a Caucasian model rests both of her hands on her hips. She wears a coral colored skirt and a beige bandeau, which is a strip of garment covering her breasts. A pair of white L-shaped wrist braces cradle her wrists. That's a lot of R and B's and C and W's. Okay, I'm sidetracking myself, which naturally curves inward. Her fingers curve and rest gently next to each other. The L-shaped braces have a hard surface, but with organic, waving edges close to the model's hands. The model's forearm are cupped with soft and creamy fabric, embroidered with clusters of white and pinkish French knots. They were tiny ball-shaped stitches. A thin mesh fabric forms ruffles on the top of the braces. The model sits on a chair wrapped in white fabric. I'm going to end my chapter here. But if there are questions about the production process for these two pieces of art, I'd be happy to talk about them during Q&A. Thank you.
This is Lauren speaking. Thanks so much, Sandie. And I'm going to stop my share because we're going to start our panel discussion. And I've seen a few answers in the Q&A, or sorry, a few questions in the Q&A already. So we'll get to those in a moment. But first, I have a few questions for the panel. So first, I know some of you have gotten to this already through your descriptions, but I'm wondering how you define your practice as an artist, as an art therapist, community organizer, activist, and how that chosen identity has impacted or informed your practice. So also how your personal art or craft practice informs the work with others in the community. And Sandie, I don't know if you want to start us off.
Sure. Lauren, for access, could we copy and paste the question in the chat so people can refer back to?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks.
And also, personally, I have short-term memory, so it's always good to have something in front of me. So for me, I forefront my practice as a disabled artist. Sometimes I don't forefront my identity as an art therapist as much because my connection and my politics about disability culture is like the primary mode of thinking for me. And of course, my practice as an art therapist is informed by disability culture, lived experience of disability. And I see my home base being connected to disability, or what we insider would say CRIP, C-R-I-P. It's not always about like identity politics. It's like, oh, you have to come out as a disabled person in order for you to take on this aesthetic or this way of approaching human relationship. But for me, it is a process where I had to look at what it means to have complexity in my life. I'm never just a person with disability. I am never a person from Taiwan who works in the States. And thinking about why have we as a society only look at differences in terms of, yeah, disabled person and period. But what about the multiple identities that this person have? And that's a place that we don't pay enough attention to. So I want to end here.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add in their thoughts on this question?
Hi, this is Marilyn speaking. I found this question so interesting because I think I'm all of these things at once, and it's like flipping hats that are constantly behind my back so that I can always put one on when I need it. As an artist, as an art therapist, a community organizer, an activist, I feel like I go through all of those different roles at different points through the day, but I'm informed in all of my decision making by each one of those roles. And so sometimes when I'm in like a therapeutic space, I have to remind myself that this is a therapeutic space, not an active space, while also recognizing that if I'm working with an African-American client that is being affected by what's going on in the world around us right now, sometimes activism can become empowering and belong in a therapeutic space. The same thing with community organization and my work as an artist. So sometimes the roles are very clearly defined and sometimes they slip together. And I think that's got to be okay, especially for the world we're currently living in. My personal arts and craft practice are always informed by my identity, the role I'm inhabiting at that moment. And I feel like I represent myself best in my artwork sometimes, and am able to clearly communicate without words some of the ideas that I have trouble articulating in spaces like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn.
This is Rachel. I definitely sort of came into this work primarily as a crafter and as an activist. It took me a long time and personal struggle to begin to identify the making I'm doing as art. And a lot of that was around understanding the way that art has been gendered and women's work has been historically erased or marginalized. But I also came into my practice because of my own experiences with disability. And because I had a period in my life, I had a bad bike crash that disrupted my life for a long time. And I discovered that I was unable to be an activist in the way that I'd always had been, and tried to sort of reimagine making community, being involved in movements in ways that worked at the speed I was able to work then. And that's really how my practice got started as an artist, was starting this community quilting work. And then through that process, understanding more about the healing power of art, both to myself personally and the communities I was working in. And really, I think more recently, being interested in these questions of art therapy and the therapeutic role, even though I am not an art therapist, I am definitely an artist who's interested in healing and how to do that on a personal and a community level through my art. So these things are, yeah, like what all of you have said, always in conversation with each other and always changing depending on our context and our moment in life.
Yeah, I also agree with what everyone is saying as well, about how they feel all reciprocal. And for me, I feel mainly like an artist, and that kind of translates to my other projects I do. And then queerness has been very centered in my work. And I think I started art therapy right as the Trump administration started. So it almost like was like activism it started like that day, within my art therapy work and research, and using crafts to like just push back against like the lack of art therapy literature and whatnot.
Thank you all. So I'm wondering where this activism and therapy and healing all overlap, and if some of you could speak to how and why you found craft to be therapeutic or healing in individual or community contexts, and how you experience or observe the benefits of crafting and potential mental health benefits and what you attribute them to. And I'm also seeing a question that I would like to tie in from Mia de Bethune, who's saying that they're interested in embodiment and art therapy and would love to hear thoughts on this topic. And I think that might fit into this portion too. And Mikey, it looks like you're about to talk. Do you want to go ahead with that?
So sorry, I was rereading the question. For me, it's kind of been my own art practice has been, I feel like the benefits have been both like when I'm crafting at home, but also when I'm in community. And so quilting has been a way to kind of be with myself and understanding the multiple layers of my identity and others. And then being in community, quilting has helped create community, connect with each other, and also as a form of sharing stories with others. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I was going to say, hi, this is Marilyn speaking. I gravitated towards crochet as a more therapeutic art process because I was a commercial artist for so long. And most of the artwork that I made as like a painter or as a graphic designer was primarily for financial gain, as some things are. So I had trouble getting out of that headspace when trying to engage in like painting or graphic work for a therapeutic purpose. And found myself gravitating more towards crochet, which is why I don't sell crochet things. I try not to engage in that and keep that solely for myself, kind of along the lines of what Mikey said of being with myself. I also think a lot of craft materials really lend themselves to being in community spaces, like knitting circles, quilting circles, things like that, that really open us up to being around other people, engaging in conversation, and finding therapeutic spaces through that. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Rachel. Again, sort of piggybacking on what everyone is saying. I think, on the one hand, on a personal level, making is a magical, incredibly powerful experience. I think there's something healing just in working with your hands and creating a thing in the universe. But I also think, as I'm sure a lot of us are feeling right now, like the injustice and the loss and the harm that's going on around us on a larger scale is incredibly isolating, and that in itself can be really damaging. So being able to make in community with people, whether it's literally like sitting in a room sewing with people, or more abstractly being a part of a movement, I think is also really healing. Feeling like you're part of a larger movement working to address the issues that are upsetting you is healing on a really big level. And I think just, I think whether it's, incarceration or police violence in my own work, feeling like you're in a room of people who are feeling the hurt and anger that you're feeling and trying to take steps to address it is really powerful and really necessary, and something that I'm really missing in my life this year and in this moment.
This is Sandie speaking. I honestly, when Lauren first reached me and invited me to write a chapter, and I was like, oh, is my work crafty enough to be in this collection? Because for me, like, I love the idea of craft. And for me, I don't really separate like what is like art and craft. I know that this is a conversation that we can have for another 2 hours, but I think the way that I engage with materials, they always come from the social interactions I have with other people. For example, I have worked as a personal assistant to a fellow activist who is a disabled woman, and so the work includes I support her with personal hygiene, and she grows her skin 100 times faster than average rate. So a lot of time removing her skin flakes is actually the work. So I end up collecting her skin flakes after each care sessions that we have together. And then I start to make pouches, little pouches, organic pouches to save these skin flakes. So skin flakes, I don't know if it is as craft or art, I don't know. But all I can say is that is something that drives me forward to explore what does that mean to make art with another human being, with my people, with my Crip sisters.
Thank you, Sandie. So I think we're coming in and out of art and healing and activism and all these questions. And my next question is how each of you think, if or how you think craft can help raise awareness of social injustices and how that factors into your work and research, and who you intend to speak to through your work. And Marilyn, can you maybe start us off with this one?
This is Marilyn speaking. Thank you, Lauren, for calling me out. But no, I think of going back to my work with the Louisville Family Justice Advocates, working with an organization that helps families with incarcerated loved ones. A lot of the work that I did there graphically was purely just to communicate the message of who we are, what we're doing, and in a very short amount of time, make people understand why this is an important cause. I mean, that's the very basis of graphic work, to communicate in short bursts why this is important, why you should pay attention, why we need your help, why we need your donation, things like that. I think art making, this is going to go into a conversation that I had on Twitter where someone was asking artists to stay out of politics. And I thought that was an completely antithetical question, because I'm like, art has always been political. Art is inherently political. Anytime an artist is making, your worldview, your beliefs, your identity is in your work, whether you want it to be or not, it's there. So I think about my work with the coalition, even though it was a paid gig, even though that's what I was doing, Marilyn is still in that logo. Marilyn is still in that website construction, and putting my all into that to make sure that I am serving my community. I am serving a population that I care about. And when I speak through my art, I'm speaking to the entirety of Kentucky. I'm speaking to the entirety of the United States. I am speaking to the world, and trying to grab enough attention to help people that I genuinely care about. So, big question, big answer.
Thank you. Anyone else want to offer thoughts on this?
I have a lot of feelings, unsurprisingly. I think one of my fears is I know that art can be incredibly powerful in transforming movements. Illinois just abolished cash bail this week, and artists played a huge role in the movement to make that possible. But I worry sometimes that, I think especially where craft is concerned, these sorts of craft projects can just serve to make people feel better without actually addressing any of the issues that they are supposed to address. I always talk about the penguin sweaters. I'm like really obsessed with these penguin sweaters, that there was an island in either New Zealand or Australia that was a penguin habitat that was impacted by an oil spill. And somebody suggested making sweaters for the penguins, which wasn't actually helpful in hindsight. Like, it's very traumatic for penguins to be put into sweaters. It doesn't improve their outlook. But people got really excited about the penguin sweaters and sent thousands and thousands of useless penguin sweaters to this island. It's like 10 years later, they're still getting them. People, like, at least once a year suggest that I make penguin sweaters. Like, people really love the penguin sweaters. So the real question for me is, like, I know art can change things, but like, how do I make sure that I'm not just making penguin sweaters, right? How do I connect people back up to activism, that I'm addressing root causes, that maybe instead of making feel better, I'm making people feel worse. Like, maybe it should discomfort people and, you know, spur them on to action instead of, you know, feeling really good about that penguin. So penguin sweaters, that's my takeaway.
This is Sandie speaking. I'd like to chime in after Rachel. I resonate with that a lot. I mean, not the penguin sweaters and shirts. I think it's about how, you know, we're, as a society, we're so used to this idea that we want to do charity work. We want to help disabled people. We want to help people in communities in need. And a lot of time, we need to check our own ego. It's like, how are you helping? Is that what they really need? And is that something that we're doing to make us feel better because you did something? So just a quick example that for those of you who may not be familiar with disability art as a movement, it is different from art therapy, the way that people's art is defined. So in disability art, long story short, just a very brief description for today, is people create disability art to reflect what it means to represent, like self-represent, what it means to challenge some of the assumptions and stereotypical representations of disability in the past. So many years ago, when Chicago had the first Bodies of Work Arts and Culture Festival, the first round back in 2006, that some art therapists were involved. And so there were exhibitions featuring artwork made by clients from shelter workshop and from therapeutic programs. And the second year, which was like 6 or 7 years later, because of budget, 2013, we had a second festival. And we decided that we like to address disabled artists who wants to pursue professional art as a career, as an exhibiting artist, as activism. So we decided that, you know, we want to focus. And so that actually pissed off quite a lot of art therapists and social workers. They were like, what? You're not including us now? But we helped you so much in the past. And so it was a really interesting conversation to see, like, wait a minute, when a group of disabled people are using art to make a platform, and what's going on? Like, people who have helped the movement in the past are now trying to figure out, what is my space? So to go back to Lauren's question, for me, for this stage of my career, I am focusing on speaking to my people, especially disabled people of color. And then in my work as a teacher, I am very interested in speaking to our therapy students who may be exploring their connections or affiliations with disability community, or who have not been exposed to disability culture, and they're trying to figure out what is this, and how do we create a space for disabled therapists to really address the lived experience within our own field. Because my critique is like has not been enough room for people to claim a space. So we keep on getting stuck on either me, us, or them. Like we as the helper and then them as the helpee. And so this is an area that I'm interested in challenging more and finding people who have similar interests.
Yeah, this is Mikey speaking. I think that's something using most recently, I feel like my audience has really shifted to speaking to queer and trans youth through like the plushies that we make together, and kind of using our plushies to like reimagine gender and sexuality. An interesting thing is, because they are my audience, and I feel like our plushies are all hanging out, there is a sense that a lot of caregivers don't allow them to be a part of these queering like classes that I'm offering. And so I guess in a lot of ways, I'm just always trying to shift my focus to speaking to them and creating art with them, for them. And like an interesting thing I'm noticing now with my artwork is it's shifted to being more like digital work, because I feel like it can get ideas out really quickly and kind of mirrors that like social media of like, it only will last for like 2 seconds. Whereas some of my craft work, like even behind here, would take like hours to make. And by the time it's done, the issue has already like bypassed. So that's just something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Thank you all. So this is Lauren speaking. I'm mindful of time because we only have about 20 minutes left. And Rachel, well, all of you have been touching on this last question I really wanted to get to before we go to the audience Q&A. And I'm like balancing the complexity of it with time. So this is not a great construct, but I'm wondering if we can do a lightning round, because I think this idea of, questioning feel-good intentions, figuring out, are we really helping, how we make sure to reduce harm, even acknowledge that we might cause harm in what we're trying to do, are all really, really important things. And also, how do we move from raising awareness to action? And so I know this is really hard to answer quickly, but if everyone could just give like, a sentence of your thoughts on this, I think it'd be great. And then we'll go into some audience Q&A. And Rachel, I feel like this is your wheelhouse, so.
I'm just gonna say be prepared to make mistakes. This is Rachel, but that I am asking these questions constantly and I'm doing it wrong over and over again. But as long as you're willing to learn and grow from that, that's okay.
Anyone else want to add some thoughts on this? I know some of you have already addressed this.
This is Sandie speaking. Just want to quickly share a concept that we talk quite a lot in disability culture community, which is crip time, C-R-I-P, crip. Again, that's short for cripple, used to be a derogatory term to describe disabled people, but now we reclaim it. So yes, crip time, thank you, Lauren, for typing it in the chat. So this idea of like the larger system, our whole society has its own pace production based, like make, be happy, and then do things and make yourself useful and productive. But a lot of time, that's not how a lot of disabled people and people of color experience the world. So what if you are having a really awful day because of your chronic illness? Or what if it's just a bad day for emotional stress? So I think one thing that I will say to answer the question is, how do we create a different timeline that makes each of us can really reshape the idea of pace for each other? And it also means to hold each other accountable. If that's say I'm really having a hard time to finish this task, I need your support. Ask for help. And also hold yourself accountable that, okay, how do I navigate the use of help so I can get the work done, if that's the goal.
This is Marilyn speaking. And along that lines, I want to talk about feedback being so important, and understanding that feedback isn't always personal, and not taking things super personally. Because if you're purporting to help people, to help certain communities, again, asking those questions, is that what this group needs? Is that what this person needs if it's on an individual level? And being, okay. And recognizing that you may make mistakes, and you need to accept that feedback when someone's telling you, hey, this is not what I need right now. In the work that I do, we talked about community work. We talked about finding resources for people and wanting to do therapy with them. And they use the washing machine problem, where a woman who is leaving her abuser just says what she needs is a washing machine. She doesn't need therapy. She doesn't need housing. She doesn't need this. She says, I just need a washing machine. She's telling you what she needs, rather than trying to circumvent and do your own work and meet your own goals. I don't know, maybe listen to the person who is actually telling you what they need.
Yes. And I'll just add, having the humility to know that sometimes you're not the one to provide it, and how to help them find who can. All right, so we have about 15 minutes left, because I'm being generous with the clock here, if that's okay with folks. And we have about 14 questions. I think we've answered a couple already. But I'm trying to find, Michelle, who's an art psychotherapist in London, is interested in how folks practice art therapy or craft with clients, and if you establish the same therapeutic boundaries, and do you co-create together? I think that's always an interesting question in art therapy, is, are you making art with folks? Marilyn, go ahead. I saw that you.
Speaking of boundaries, I think boundaries are so important, especially if you're in that specific therapeutic space. I do co-create with clients. A lot of times I either work alongside them or mirror them. I think about just yesterday, I was crocheting with a client, and we were sitting talking about a grief process, but crocheting at the same moment. And there was a seeking of synchronicity or of congruence, just by the action of crocheting together, to make sure we were both kind of in the same space and on the same level at the same time. And boundary seeking, it's the same as just with regular talk therapy a lot of the time, establishing things like confidentiality, how we store artwork, how what needs to leave this room, what needs to stay in this room. So it's the same as, I think, a general therapeutic relationship. Art making is just a part of communication, and establishing relationship with a therapeutic client.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. This is Mikey speaking. I agree with everything Marilyn's saying. I always make art alongside clients, and in my groups I take from what the youth are like offering. And if like in our last group we were talking about Among Us characters, so then I made a bunch of Among Us characters with them. And so yeah, I think it's been a really cool way to kind of build community and relationships.
So I'm seeing another question. Teresa's asking, any advice for an artist, grad student interested in art therapy or community healing projects, and where to start? And sorry, maybe that's a big question. Thanks, Teresa. But I'm wondering, and what folks think about where you start when you're thinking of collaborating with communities.
This is Rachel speaking. I just can say from my experience that building relationships is really slow and it's not going to happen overnight. So I think having a lot of time to have conversations with people you're interested in working with, again, trying to ask what they need, Marilyn, that's so true, and figuring out ways to develop together. I often will have a nugget of an idea, but I don't I don't put together a whole project without talking to my intended partners first, because it might go in really different directions. And then also knowing how much your partners want to engage in this project. So maybe it's a group that wants to inform it, but doesn't want to handle the administration, or wants to participate but not plan, and being flexible about being where people are at. So sometimes a project will come up really collaboratively and organically from the very beginning, but oftentimes I'll be like, I feel an urge to do a project about blah. Who are groups I know who are doing good work on that already? Can I sit down and get coffee or have a phone call with them and find out what they think would be useful or exciting or beautiful or moving in addressing that issue?
This is Sandie speaking. Just want to say, like, I resonate with what Rachel just said a lot. And I think one place where you can begin is ask yourself, what pisses you off? Like, what makes you feel like I am burning inside? What pisses you off in the way that you can no longer cover your own mouth? So that would be a good place to start. So I'm not gonna tell you, what do you enjoy? Follow your love, follow your passion. I mean, getting your fuel burned and turning anger into actions is a really great way to get things started.
So I think let's do one more question, maybe two more, we'll see where we get. This is from Andy, who's asking, can you speak a bit more about socioeconomic disparities and inequality in terms of people having access to these healing opportunities, maybe especially during the pandemic?
Hi, this is Marilyn speaking. So socioeconomic disparity is something I'm super, super passionate about. And it's actually why I chose to align myself with the organization I currently work for. I work for Call for Help in East St. Louis, because art therapy specifically is one of those practices that I think can be very highbrow in some places and not accessible to, I think, people who need it the most. So in my own practice, I wanted to be an art therapist that is available to the community that I wanted to serve. And that meant finding an organization that is also committed to accessibility of mental health services, and aligning myself with those people whose mission matches my own. So now I work for a place where I can do either pro bono work for art therapy, or I can do $30 a session self-pay, or we take any Medicaid client or Medicare client. And that is something that I'm super passionate about. And as I continue to build in the field, want to continue to advocate for for our therapists to be more accessible to people who need us and not just for people who can afford us.
This is Rachel. I just also want to speak to meeting, like literally meeting people where they're at. So moving my work around physically has been really important, and being hosted by community organizations, because people are a lot more likely to come do a weird thing with you if they're doing it in a place that's comfortable for them and with people they already know. And that gets a lot harder in the pandemic. You know, I don't know if there's a good answer to that, but yeah, going to where people already are has worked really well for me.
It's something I'll just add into this is one thing I brought up when I was talking about the group I work with is the digital divide and how that's impacting people's access during the pandemic. And so on one hand, we're able to have people from all over the country in this virtual event, and that's wonderful. And also most of the people I work with in that group couldn't be here today because they don't have access. So that's something that I'm thinking a lot about right now in the pandemic. Wondering if panelists are seeing a question that they're really hoping to answer in the Q&A.
I guess I can speak to the identity formation. So this is Mikey speaking, and the question is, have you worked specifically with queer clients on identity formation, and what does that look like? And so all of this has been happening virtually, and then I think it even ties back to the other question of every youth gets an art kit, and then within that art kit are different like craft, like super campy craft materials that kind of speak to queer artists, and then but even like drawings of how they can maybe plot their gender or sexuality, and kind of using their plushies as like creating their gender as a character, and then being able to interact with that character and create a home for that character and like a brave space for that character. Because a lot of the times we're finding out that a lot of the some youth are having to like secretly come online with us, which or I have to use like coded language with guardians. So that's been something that's been a little bit tricky as well. But yeah, just trying to use, because there's so many queer cartoons out there right now, and youth are seeing themselves in like Steven Universe and She-Ra, and I don't know, it's pretty cool.
We're getting there. I just want to thank everyone for attending, and super especially thank all of the panelists and also authors for the book, and also the Fuller Craft Museum. I'm really reflecting on I guess my worry about what's happening to museums now, and if this was happening in person, everyone attending would have paid an admission fee. So I'm going to share my screen right now because I have a little bit of info. If you want to donate and or become a member, you can find that at this web address. Also, if you want to order a copy of the book, please order it from Routledge and not Amazon. And there's a 20% discount. And finally, thank you again for being here. Please feel free to reach out if you had a question that we didn't get to. And yeah, also please feel free to email me. I had a list of resources that we may have referenced, and because of the webinar function, I couldn't attach it to the chat. So if you would like that, it has information about the Indigenous organizations that I mentioned during the land acknowledgement, each of the panelists' full bio, and also their contact info, and maybe something else that I don't remember. So please feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat right now.
I just wanted to say thanks to everybody, especially my panelists. You know, I like to say that I'm community taught because literally everything I know about life or craft or art or activism, I learned from the people around me. And I'm just really grateful to be able to be in spaces like this and keep learning. So thanks you guys for sharing so much about your work and your practice.
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank Lauren and the rest of the panelists, Rachel, Marilyn, Mikey, Sandie. Thank you so much for being here and joining us today. This has been a really, really interesting discussion. I really think it's been a pleasure to see all of your work and hear a little bit more of your practice, and look forward to you know, learning more from the book and perhaps from future collaborations. I want to share another thanks to my colleagues and any other of our board members for being here, our members as well. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our captioner, Erica Cook, and please reach out to us at floorcraft.org. There will be a recording of this panel event available after today, and it will be emailed to all registered viewers. So thanks again from Fuller Craft Museum, and thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today.